Robert Louis Stevenson was the son of a Scottish lighthouse engineer, and he was expected to follow his father into engineering, but he changed his studies to law and became an advocate. Suffering from a chronic lung complaint, he travelled abroad to live in the sun, and there he began to write travel books, essays, and short stories, followed by his novels, which were an immediate success. He met his future wife in California, and they settled in Samoa. Amongst the locals, Stevenson became known as a kind of honorary chief, as he helped the people to judge disputes. And he also told the local stories. So Stevenson was known by the Samoans as Tusitala, which means the teller of tales. When Stevenson died, aged only 44, in 1894, he was buried on the island of Samoa, which he had grown to love. Carved into his gravestone are the words he wrote for himself. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill. Stevenson told tales that will live forever, and from the beginning of time, human beings have loved to tell tales. When I was at school, I think perhaps my favourite part of the day was story time. I can still remember some of the stories we were told and the books we read. And when I became a teacher, I equally loved story time, except that now it was me who had become Tusitala, the teller of tales, and not the eager listener. I remember storytelling with the children on holidays, usually ghost stories. Everyone sat on the floor, the lights low, when sometimes you could hear a pin drop, especially if it was windy outside and the rain could be heard tapping on the window panes. Then a drink and off to bed, mindful that the ankle grabber who lives beneath the bed isn't really real. But just be a little careful. Don't hang about getting into bed, because you can never be quite sure. The ankle grabber, after all, could be real. Stories which have been handed down by word of mouth were usually written down, and then works of fiction began to be available to everyone. Stories that people could actually hold in their hands. And then, of course, the stories of the cinema and television and radio. We're surrounded by stories, and what a dull place the world would be without tellers of these tales. Jesus was a great storyteller. People were drawn to him because he kept them entertained. He told tales of lost sheep, wayward sons, forgiving fathers, victims of violence, mislaid money, wise and foolish people, buildings rising and falling, farmers, landowners, plants, birds, the rich and the poor, all of them coming to life through storytelling. In his parables, Jesus tells a story in which he describes an everyday event, and then he always asks the question, what would you do in such a situation? So that when such a problem arises, the listener can think back and have their own ideas of what they should do. The parables of Jesus were designed to carry the listener's thinking beyond the literal meaning of the words to a deeper symbolic understanding of life. And this is achieved as the listener is challenged to answer simple questions such as, which among you, having 100 sheep and losing one, would not go after it? A question that most would answer in the same way. And then the listener discovers a profound truth about how God comes looking for us and regards no one as beyond hope. Anyone who enjoys a good story, and who doesn't, will find that they can discuss them for ages. Think of the soaps and the dramas which catch our imagination. Line of Duty, Call the Midwife, and so many more. When a story connects, we talk about it with friends, family, and even strangers. Such is the power of stories, storytelling. The parables have been often called earthly stories with a heavenly meaning. Jesus used every means to challenge his listeners, and he very often used humour. Shakespeare interspersed moments of tragedy and drama with humour, as all great storytellers do, and Jesus was no exception. His parables, are full of humour. We usually miss the humour because the stories are very often told with great solemnity as they're read out in church. Jesus once told the story of a blind man taking another blind man by the hand to show him the way, which resulted in both of them tumbling over and falling into a ditch. Jesus didn't use this image because he found anything amusing in blindness, but rather in a blind man leading another blind man. He wanted his listeners to laugh at the foolishness of the situation, and then in the pause which follows the laughter, to start to feel uncomfortable as they and we begin to understand slowly that we're just as ridiculous as these two men whenever we give moral advice to people when we ourselves are very often no better at obeying God. This really is the blind leading the blind. In the parables in today's readings, you'll find the reading of a man who sowed good seed in the earth, and then his enemy coming along and sowing weeds amongst them. Would he be such a fool as to dig them up before they're ripe? We, the listeners, laugh at the idea of such stupidity. But why do we ask God to remove the wicked people in the world when there is good and there is bad in all of us? People very often disregard a seed because it is so tiny. However, seeds can push over paving stones, and we tend to forget that mighty oaks grow from tiny acorns. As Jesus reminds us of this, a wry smile appears on our faces. So why do we despair because only a minority of Western Europeans go to church? In Africa and Asia, the numbers of Christians is growing faster than they can build new churches to hold them. Perhaps our loss is their gain. From small ideas grow great initiatives. One person's dream can become the hopes of hundreds, thousands, millions. Who knows where God will lead us? We all learn from stories. The parables of Jesus told 2,000 years ago, many so familiar that we do not even stop to consider their meaning, are just as powerful and just as profound as they ever were. We should never underestimate the power of stories and those who tell them, because they still have the power to teach us about ourselves, about the world, and about God.